name is Janet Beckekr. I'm a flutist and flute teacher here in Northeast Ohio, and I'd like to welcome you to my studio today for a program that we're calling All About the Flute. During this program, I will play all of these different kinds of flutes that you see here next to me. And I'll also be giving you some information about their history, how they were made, what they're made out of, and some of the pieces that I'll be playing as well. I think you'll enjoy this. It's an examination of where the flute started and where it has ended up today. So without any further ado, let's start learning all about the flute. The first flute that I'm going to play on the program today is this one. This is a replica of a Renaissance style flute, and as you can see, it's very simple. It's just a cylindrical tube of wood that was turned on some sort of a machine for wood turning. It has a cork in one end that seals it off, and it's open in the other end. There are 6 holes, so for your index finger, middle finger, and ring finger of each hand, and a hole that you blow across. It's not a very refined sound. It's very open, kind of hollow, and a little bit rough around the edges. So it doesn't have any of the modifications or elaborations that would be made later on. But this is the flute in its purest form. And it's the kind that was used for folk music from the very earliest days up through and into the 17th century. So this particular flute I've had for about 20 years. It's a modern instrument. It's not a copy of an old instrument or anything like that. And I think that perhaps makes it truer to the origins of the instrument, because it was designed simply as an instrument that could be played relatively easily with fingers holes that are at a comfortable distance apart. So there's no stretches, there's no modifications made to make any attempt to play it for it to be more in tune than it is. So essentially it is what we would call a flute in D. The lowest note is if you're looking at music and playing from a book of pieces, it would be a D. It doesn't actually sound like a D though. When I checked it with the tuner, the lowest note is actually an F sharp. So I'm not sure what that would make it, an F sharp flute perhaps, but it gives us essentially a 1-octave scale. And as you go up, it gets flat. So because it is a cylinder, that happens because of laws of physics and things like that. It just doesn't stay in tune as you go up higher. So we have essentially 1 octave and a bit as far as what the notes can be. So you're a little bit limited. However, for folk music and easy hymn tunes and things of that sort, it was perfectly adequate for the time. If they wanted it to be higher, they would make it smaller. If they wanted it to be lower, they would make it longer. And that was essentially how flutes were made for it when they first started actually manufacturing or making these instruments. And as I mentioned, this is a pretty rough copy. There are flutes that were made during the Renaissance that were much more precise and that had a lot more thought that went into them in terms of making them play in tune and in good pitch and in concert with others. There's some wonderful pictures of flute bands that would play on horseback in the Germanic area during the 16th century. And there are some examples of very large flutes from the time that required quite a bit of contorting to get your body to be able to cover all the keys and to make everything work. But this was a folk instrument, and I believe it was flutes of this sort were used to play for dance music and for singing along with. If you were playing with a string instrument like a lute or a simple guitar, you could tune that instrument to play in tune with this one. So the fact that it's in a weird, funny key wouldn't really matter. The pieces that I'm playing on this flute today are a courant and a branle. And the courant is part of a collection that was done by Jan van Eyck during the early 17th century. And the branle is, I believe, by Gervais, who was a 17th century French composer. Enjoy. The next flute that I'm going to play is this one. This is a Baroque flute, and flutes of this type were used primarily during the 18th century. And you can see it's quite different from the Renaissance style flute. For one thing, it's shaped different. Where the Renaissance flute is cylindrical, this is what we call a conical shape. It's much thicker at the top of the flute, at where we blow into it, than it is at the bottom. And it also has a key, which was a miraculous and amazing improvement to the instrument, because you could never get your pinky over the hole down at the bottom, but with the use of the key, you can open and close it quite easily. And it's the start of making the instrument much more chromatic, which means you can play in more keys and you can do more complicated pieces. Other than that, it still is remarkably like the Renaissance flute. A hole to blow into at the top and 6 holes for your fingers. One of the things that makes this flute different as well is that it's made out of ebony. My other little Renaissance flute is made out of a purple plum wood that I got because I liked the color. This has nothing to do with color, but ebony reacts differently when you blow air into it. It's a harder wood, and it makes it project the sound differently, and it gives the notes a very different quality. Another thing that's different about this flute is our lowest note is still a D, as it was sort of on the Renaissance flute, but it now has a much larger range. You can easily do a 2-octave range, and you can even go up higher. So that was a high F sharp right there, and it can go on even higher. And we know that composers enjoyed that. Some composers, like Johann Sebastian Bach, even composed to the pieces that utilize the A natural above that high F sharp that I just played. So it was not an unusual thing for the range to be expanding as composers were writing more demanding music. This flute is a copy of a flute that was made by a maker named Tassi. It was made by Simon Pollack, a Dutch flute manufacturer in, let's see, I think I got it in 2007. It was probably made in 2006. It's made out of ebony, as I mentioned before, and it's pitched at 392 for the A natural. If any of you are sitting there with tuners out, you can check me. And 392 makes the sound of the instrument about a half step lower than our modern pitch of 440. So if any of you have perfect pitch and I'm saying that I'm playing an A and you're thinking, no, it's an A flat, that explains it. So it's pitched at 392. It's a little bit lower to our ears, which gives the sound a very different quality. One of the interesting things at the time is that there were a lot of different pitches in Europe. Some places had a lower pitch. France tended to have a lower pitch. Some places had a higher pitch. Germany's pitches tend to be higher. And the flutes at the time would take that into consideration. There are a number of flutes that have come down in museum, or that are now in museums and have survived, that have multiple middle joints. The second part of the instrument would be made slightly longer or slightly shorter. And by switching out the middle joint, you could adjust the pitch that you were playing in. So if you were a traveling musician and were concertizing throughout Europe, and there were a few flutists who did do that, you would need to be able to adjust to the pitch wherever you were. So you would swap out your middle joint. So in some cases there are as many as 6 middle joints included with the flutes at the time. Now you still had to work hard to play in tune. That was a given, but that at least would get you closer to the ballpark, you might say, and it would make it a little bit easier to play in tune with the people who were in the community where you were giving your concert. So the piece that I'm going to perform on this flute is a transcription of a piece by Francois Couperin. Couperin wrote the Nightingale in Love for the harpsichord, and it demonstrates a great use of ornamentation and little birdie sorts of trills and mordents and things of that sort. And as soon as it was written, it was co-opted by those of us in the flute community, because we all know the flute sounds like a bird. Enjoy. next flute I'm going to demonstrate is this one. This is an 8-keyed flute from the 19th century. It started to be used in this form probably as early as about 1820, maybe 1825, and it continued to be used in the same format up through the present day. In fact, if you happen to enjoy Irish music or folk music, and they have a flute player, there's a very good possibility they may be playing a flute that's based on this system. We call this a simple system flute, and it's basically simple because it's like the Baroque flute. It has 6 holes, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, just like the Baroque flute had. It's got the same kind of conical shape, so wider at the top, skinnier at the bottom, and it has a similar range. The lowest note in this case is not D, because 2 of those keys that have been added are a C sharp and a low C. So the lowest note is middle C. The pitch on this instrument is A440. So this is up to modern pitch now, or what we consider to be modern pitch. And the 8 keys that were added were added to make it easier, somewhat, or more in tune is probably the more correct reason, so for playing in different keys. So there is a key for B flat, which is actually not a bad thing, because playing B flat on a Baroque flute is a complicated collection of cross fingerings. The same thing with the F natural. In order to play an F natural, all you have to do now is finger in E and add this little key. Or if you want to, and it works better in your music, you can add it with the pinky of your left hand. We still have our E flat / D sharp key. We also have a key for C natural, and there is 1 trill key that will give you high register trills. So all in all, it's a fairly simple system, and the sound is a little bit different again from the Baroque flute. The Baroque flute has a pretty much cylindrical circle type of tone hole. There might be a little bit of undercutting to make it play a little better, but it's basically a small round hole that you blow across. With this kind of flute, they start making the tone hole that you blow into bigger and more of an oval shape, and that helps to create more sound. Stronger the high register is than on the Baroque flute, and certainly more than the Renaissance flute. The high register becomes very strong in these instruments. This is also referred to as a Meyer system flute, and that's because this A flat key that I forgot to mention has this particular characteristic shape, and that's when you see one like that, we know right away that it's either a Meyer system or frequently what we'll call Nachmeyer. And Nachmeyer is just German for after Meyer. So while this one is completely unnamed, I don't know who made it or when it was made. I assume that it was probably made around the turn of the 20th century. And I actually found this one in a music store in Cleveland. Enjoy. demonstrated 3 different more historical type of flutes today. There are many people who have much more complete collections of instruments with a lot of different key systems. But that gives you kind of a taste of what was going on in the past. Now I'm going to bring you into the present. So this is my concert C flute that I use on a daily basis. It's made by the Vern Q. Powell Company, and it is made out of what they call armite, which is sterling silver on the outside of the tube, bonded to 14 karat gold on the inside. And it is fairly typical for instruments today. This particular flute is pitched at A440, just like the Myers or the Meyer system 8-key flute, but it looks a lot different. The shape has become very different again. So now what we see is it looks more like a cylinder again. The head joint has a little bit of a curve to it, but not very much. It's a very subtle shape on the head joint. And the body is almost a perfect cylinder from the end of the head joint down. There's a lot of keys, lots and lots of keys. And so the system works a little bit different than it used to. Many of these holes have keys that we close to cover the holes, and frequently keys will be linked together so that you can put down 2 or even 3 keys with the use of one finger and by only touching one key. Most of the keys are open standing, some are closed standing, and those are actually similar to what we've had in the past. The E flat key hasn't changed from the first time it was added onto the instrument at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. We still have this little right hand pinky key for our E flats. From the time they first added the A flat key, it has stayed the same as well. So both of the pinkies have what we call closed keys, and when you push down on the keys, it opens the key up. But all of the other keys, for the most part, are open standing keys, and you cover the hole when you push your finger down. So those are the only 2 that are harken back to the early days of the instrument. This is the kind of instrument that your granddaughter would have played in band, or that you might have played yourself. This is the basic instrument that is still used by all of our friends and relatives who have played the flute. So this is the primary instrument that most of us are familiar with today. And so because it is such a basic instrument for all of us, I chose to play a basic piece. So the selection that I chose to play on this flute is Syrinx by Claude Debussy, which is surely one of the most iconic pieces for solo flute today. alto flute, it is pitched in G, which means that it's, when I finger my lowest notes, my low C, it actually sounds a G below middle C. So it still has its 2.5, almost 3 octave range, but it starts at a lower point. And you can see how much bigger it is. The tube is wider and it's much longer. So that creates some interesting issues as far as position when you're playing it. You have to stretch your arms out a little bit more if you're playing with a straight head joint. One of the things that they've come up with in the past 20 years is putting a curve in the head joint so that it brings it up closer to you. But the curve adds additional issues. I find that when I use the curved head joint, the intonation is much less stable. So I just do it and do the stretch so that the low register is more in tune with the upper register. It has a very mellow sound. A lot of jazz performers really like the alto flute because of this mellow quality to the sound. So it's a different sort of tone color that you get with an alto flute than what you have with a regular C flute. The piece that I'm going to play on this instrument is called Echoes in the Wind. It's by an American composer named Phyllis Avedon Locke, and it is supposed to be representational of Native American flute sounds. So picture that while you're listening to this particular piece. This is a bass flute, and the bass flute sounds a full octave lower than a regular C flute. So when I play my lowest note on this flute, that's the C below middle C. And then the range is 2.5 octaves above that. Except the high E doesn't like to come out on this particular instrument. There it is. There it goes. It goes a little bit higher still. So what you hear though as you go higher and higher on this instrument is you hear a lot more stuff in the sound. You're hearing the lower harmonics and they're having an impact on the tone quality. So it's not really a pure tone when you get up there. You hear a lot of other stuff. So composers generally pick their range and they either utilize the high register because they like the way those harmonics sound, or they stay away from them because they prefer a more pure tone from the low register. So again, it has a very mellow sound and a very smooth tone quality. The piece that's going to be played on this instrument will be performed by a student of mine from Mount Union. Natalie Kaufman is going to play a piece called The Sacred Cauldron, which is from a collection of pieces called Baikal Journey by Catherine McMichael. And it's written about the area of Russia around Lake Baikal, and it's a very mysterious sort of piece. I'm sure it's a mysterious area, at least it is to me since I've never been there. But when you look at pictures, it's Central Asia, Russia. It's very full of forests, and Lake Baikal was at one point one of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And it's a lovely piece that utilizes the low register and some of the higher register as well. next instrument we're going to consider today is the piccolo. The piccolo is much smaller than the regular flute and certainly smaller than the alto and the bass and the contra that you see here over my shoulder. The piccolo plays a full octave above the C flute, which means that it's written in normal range that we would look at on the musical staff, but when you play it, it sounds an octave higher. That causes some interesting issues with the piccolo. For one, it is extremely high to play and to listen to, so it becomes necessary to wear earplugs sometimes when you're practicing or even when you're performing in order to protect your hearing. You also need to share those earplugs with your family members. I had one student once who gave her entire family sets of earplugs for Christmas one year when she was practicing piccolo a lot. The piccolo has some issues with intonation that they work hard to correct when they manufacture them by making the head joint a conical shape, starts smaller at this end and gets wider at where it connects to the body. They call those bubble head joints sometimes. And then it gets narrower again as it gets down to the end of the tube. So it's kind of an interesting shape. It starts a little bit smaller, gets a little wider, and then it gets considerably smaller at this end. So it's similar a little bit to the Baroque flute, but the Baroque flute tends to have a steadier cone shape as it goes down. This particular piccolo is made out of wood. It's a grenadilla wood with silver-plated keys. They also make them out of king wood. Sometimes you'll see them made out of other different kinds of woods as well. And frequently you'll find them with solid silver keys or even with gold keys sometimes. Those are really pretty. But I don't think it makes a huge difference in the tone, but it sure does look nice. You'll also find a lot of piccolos made out of metal. Those are the ones that are most frequently used by marching bands. Those tend to have a cylindrical shape rather than a conical shape. So I think because it's easier to manufacture a tube with a cylindrical shape, but then you have to work harder to play it in tune. You'll also find them frequently these days made out of plastic. And plastic can be a good compromise because you can maintain better intonation with the conical shape by molding plastic, and you can also make them in pretty colors. So I have known students to come in with pink piccolos or blue piccolos. There's a couple manufacturers in Asia that are doing them in multiple different colors, and that's a lot of fun for students. And they actually play remarkably well, although they don't look quite as serious as your black orchestral model piccolo. So the piece that I will be playing is called The Fearless Whistler by Michael Isaacson, and it represents what all of us who play the piccolo have to be. Last but not least, by a long shot, is this monster. This is a contrabass flute, and this particular contrabass flute is owned by the University of Mount Union, and since I teach there, they're letting me use it for this concert. This particular flute is about 25 years old now, I believe, and it is made out of PVC pipe. So this part here is plastic PVC pipe, and then it has the metal silver plated head joint and keys. It is essentially a giant flute. We have this very similar key system, although it is much larger, and it's a little more complicated because keys have to be linked together differently because of compensating for the size. This instrument plays in the low bass register. It is, in fact, its range is very similar to that of a double bass. The piece that I'm going to play on it is the elephant from Saint-Saëns Carnival of the Animals, and I basically have the double bass part that I'm playing on the contrabass flute. So that is the range of the instrument. So that's our low C. There's middle C. So then it can go up a little bit higher. About 2.5 octaves for the range for this particular instrument. It is really big. It's also pretty heavy. Obviously, we can't hold it up easily, so it has a peg to put so that it can be adjusted for the height of the player. These also come in a full metal construction, and in many cases, I think the metal ones actually play a little bit easier. The bore is, or the diameter of the bore of the instrument is not quite as large on the metal ones, and I think it makes it respond a little bit easier. There are even larger ones out there though. Double contra takes it down another octave, or some people call them subcontras, and in some cases it becomes almost more like a how low can you go contest to see how big a flute you can actually make and have it actually respond and work. It's a lot of fun to play. It certainly makes for a wonderful photo op, and it's kind of an interesting challenge too, as I have found with this project, playing things ranging from piccolo to contrabass flute and making switches back and forth between modern and historic instruments has certainly been a good challenge for my brain with all the different fingering systems and all of the different things that you have to do. I've had a lot of fun putting this all together though, and I'd like to thank you all for watching, and I hope if you have any questions that you can leave comments and I'll get back to you with any information that I might have left out or things that I might have left you confused on. But thank you so much for watching. Enjoy the elephant. Bye-bye.